We often think of the Founding Fathers as stiff, emotionless, and religious men who lived and thought in a very religious way. They look at us from cold marble statues and old pictures. They are morally and formally good people. Time and stories have made them less human. In fact, most of them were passionate, angry men, which is what you'd expect from someone who is rebelling against true, long-standing power. They weren't just angry at King George and taxes or discussing slavery and a new form of government. They were also very passionate about other things. Many people's barely contained emotions led to extramarital affairs, children they didn't have the right to, and scandals that were talked about in the nation's parlors and shown on the front pages of the nation's newspapers. For some, they led to meetings on the so-called field of honor, where they had to face someone who had hurt them with guns in the dark. The fact that Abigail Adams wrote so many letters to her husband John and to many of his co-workers shows that sex played a role in the formation of the government, and some of the founders were made fun of by their peers because they liked to have sexual relations. Following are 10 examples of the sex lives of America's founders, some of which have been scandalous for many years. Thomas Jefferson and Maria Cosway. In 1786, Thomas Jefferson met Maria Cosway, who was 27 years old, at the Haymarket in Paris. Jefferson was in his early 40s and had just lost his wife. Jefferson's wife got him to promise to never marry again while she was dying, but the statesman and scholar fell in love with Maria right away and canceled his dinner plans for that day to spend the rest of the day with her. Because they both liked architecture and art, they spent several weeks touring the sights of Paris and its suburbs together. That is, until Maria's husband, the miniature painter Richard Cosway, demanded that she go back to London with him. Jefferson stayed in Paris for a while. Since then, people have argued about whether their friendship was sexual or just friendly. Jefferson did write Maria many letters after she left, but one of them he called The Dialogue of the Head versus the Heart. The 4000-word letter is a conversation between the two organs, with one asking for a continued relationship and the other drawing attention to how it can't work. It is still one of the most emotional love letters ever written. Jefferson and Cosway both kept pictures of the other for the rest of their lives. They also wrote to each other, and even though they stopped writing for a while, they quickly started again and kept doing so until Cosway's death in 1826. In a strange twist, the picture of Maria Jefferson that was kept at Monticello was based on a drawing that her husband had made of her. Benjamin Franklin's advice to a young man. Over the course of his long life, Benjamin Franklin earned the image of being what people now call a ladies' man. He didn't say anything to make them doubt it. People knew him as Poor Richard. In his almanac, he wrote aphorisms with wise sayings like, "She who paints her face thinks of her tail," and "Neither a fortress nor a maidenhead will hold out long after they begin to parley." The boy Franklin had from a previous relationship was brought into his common-law marriage by Franklin. Franklin lived with this wife for most of his life. During his long trips away from his home in Philadelphia, he was always with women. This was especially true in France before the Revolution, where he was the talk of the town and was surrounded by French noble women, even though he was already 90 years old at the time. Before that, in 1745, Franklin sent a letter to a friend's son. The subject was how to deal with sexual feelings in a healthy way. Franklin first suggested getting married, but then he wrote that having an older woman as a lover would be better, even though he admitted that this might not be possible. One of his honest reasons was that two women can't tell the difference between an old and a young woman based on what's below the girdle, especially at night. Franklin also said that the experience of an older woman was better than that of a younger woman. His last reason was that they were so grateful. In the United States, the letter was banned from publication in the 1800s and early 1900s because it contained sexual content. However, rules against this were later overturned. Alexander Hamilton's affairs were numerous and scandalous. In 1791, a 23-year-old woman went to see Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury in Philadelphia. She said that her violent husband had left her without any money. That evening, he went to her house and introduced himself with money and sexual intentions. They began an affair that lasted all summer. When her husband came back in the fall, he used the chance to blackmail Hamilton by threatening to write to Hamilton's married wife. Mrs. and Mr. Reynolds, James, and Maria got Hamilton to pay them a lot of money to keep the affair a secret. Despite Hamilton's payment for quiet, the affair went on, and James Reynolds knew about it. There were also letters from Maria to Hamilton that proved it. After Reynolds was caught for a scam that had nothing to do with the affair, he begged Hamilton for help and threatened to publicly link the secretary to both the scam and the affair. Hamilton asked James Monroe for help, and Monroe said that Hamilton wasn't guilty of the first charge, but was guilty of the second. When the press learned about both stories, Hamilton openly admitted to having an affair and apologized in a pamphlet he put out. He denied doing anything wrong other than cheating on his wife. It was almost impossible for him to keep his political position or reputation. In another example of irony in history, Maria Reynolds finally filed for divorce from her husband. She was represented by Aaron Burr as her lawyer in the case. Gouverneur Morris enjoyed a potentially exhibitionist affair on France. Gouverneur Morris wrote, "We, the people of the United States," which is one of the most popular phrases ever. Morris was famous among his peers for his sexual preferences, but not many people remember this about him today. Morris had affairs with married women in the US and France while he was single until he was 57 years old. He wasn't very interested in being discreet. He was known to have had sex in the Louvre in Paris, which was then the King of France's home. One of these meetings took place in a public room in the house, with doors and windows open to let servants and guests in. The lady's husband was in the room below them. Morris happily wrote about the tryst in his book, as he did with many of them. It wasn't until 1809 that Morris finally got married. It was to his maid, who was 22 years younger than him and had been tried for murder and adultery before. If she was caught cheating on her husband with her brother-in-law in 1792, she would have been charged with adultery. She was charged with murder after the baby died, even though she told the court the baby had not been born yet. Morris had only one leg when he got married. He had lost the other one when he was hit by a carriage. Morris was running away from an angry husband who had just found the founding father sleeping with his wife. Morris kept wooing women all through his life, which made John Jay say that he wished Morris had lost something else. George Washington was subject to accusations of affairs throughout his life. There was a time when people in Virginia called George Washington the young stallion of the Potomac. Washington spent a lot of time with young women, and when he was with them, he often lost his famous reserve. Dancing was one of his favorite things to do, and he could always find someone to dance with. People said that he never skipped a dance. Washington was deeply in love with the wife of his neighbor and friend George William Fairfax when he was younger, before he became famous all over the United States and Europe. The Fairfax family lived at Belvoir, which is close to Mount Vernon. Washington visited Lady Fairfax, whom he called Sally, and wrote letters to her in which he told her he loved her. During the Revolutionary War, Loyalists and British spies tried to hurt Washington's reputation by writing about his relationships with slaves, servants, and the wives of his officers, as well as the fact that he had children with these women who were not his. Many of these stories were brought up again by his political opponents while he was president, especially in his second term, and some are still told by people who want to change the past. While Washington was married to Martha, she already had children from a previous marriage. He adopted her children from that marriage. Martha was a widow when she married George. Aside from a few letters to Sally Custis that have been found, Washington's papers don't talk about his sexual life, whether he was single or married. However, people of both sexes who lived at the same time as him knew how much he liked being around beautiful women. John Adams despised licentiousness and had 6 children with his wife, Abigail. Being from a Puritan family in Massachusetts, John Adams was very much the model of a good New Englander. Adams was a farmer and lawyer who married Abigail Smith in 1754. During their marriage, Adams's mother-in-law treated him with barely concealed disdain. Mrs. Smith was very against Abigail getting married, and she was especially against her pick of a Boston lawyer who didn't own anything. Adams didn't get his small farm until 7 years after he died. During John's many long absences, he and his wife kept up a long correspondence with each other. It is through this correspondence that the thoughts and deeds of many of the founders are known to history. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and Gouverneur Morris loved how wild and sexy Paris was. But Adams and Abigail, who often spoke harshly, found it shocking and unpleasant. They had 6 children together, but one was stillborn and the other died when it was a baby. His 3 sons all became lawyers like their father. 2 of them failed at their jobs and died drunk. John Quincy was the other one who became president of the U.S. Most of the letters that John and Abigail wrote to each other have been preserved. They show that they respected, loved, and criticized each other openly. And they also talk about the hard times they had to go through as a couple. They were married for 54 years until Abigail died in 1818. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both died on July 4, 1826. This was 8 years after the death of John Adams's wife. James and Dolly Madison were the talk of Washington after their marriage. People living at the time thought that James Madison was a quiet, even sad person. He was very smart, but he didn't enjoy public speaking. His brilliance showed in his writing and in private talks. Madison met society, though that wasn't a word used at the time, and widow Dolly Payne Todd through Aaron Burr, who seemed to be everywhere. This happened while the U.S. Capitol was still in Philadelphia. In 1794, they got married in that city. Dolly was a socialite in Philadelphia and later in Washington, D.C. She was the hostess at White House dinners, levees, and other events. Washington laughed at the picture of the skinny, shy Madison, who was 17 years older than his beautiful and popular wife, but they were happily married. Madison's time away from the city and politics at his Virginia home, which he called Montpelier, made it stronger. People who came to the farm were amazed to see the president being pushed around by his wife. This was something they did even after he retired. Madison and Dolly often played piggyback races with his guests and the many kids who came to his farm. James Madison got married when he was in his early 40s, and his wife was 26 years old. They were married for a long time and were happy together. Madison didn't have any kids of his own, but he did adopt Dolly's kids from her first marriage. Dolly became a close political ally of the president and used her connections with other Washington women to change the minds of their husbands. She pretty much made the post of First Lady of the United States a source of power in Washington. The Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings debate. Scholars and historians have talked about the connection between Thomas Jefferson and his slave, Sally Hemings, even while he was still alive. The main question is whether Jefferson fathered some of her 6 children, which would make Hemings a slave mistress. By the late 1900s, DNA proof showed that Jefferson was most likely the father of at least one of Hemings's children, Eston, her youngest son. Early in the 21st century, the people who take care of Jefferson's estate at Monticello started changing things that said about his connection with Hemings, which showed that he did have several children with her. The debate goes on, and one common argument is that the proof we have right now is not enough to say for sure. We know for sure that Sally Hemings went to Paris with Maria, Jefferson's daughter. According to Jefferson's letters, Sally was sent to Paris to learn how to cook French food. When she got back to Monticello, she lived in the main house instead of the slave rooms. During Jefferson's later years, there were many rumors that he had fathered children by his maid. No one knows how they felt about their relationship because Jefferson never talked about it and only denied that it existed. Most of what people think about the connection comes from stories that Hemings's descendants have told over the years. One interesting thing about their connection is that Hemings was pregnant 6 times. Jefferson wrote down the dates of birth for each child 9 months later, which means that he was at Monticello when each child was conceived. Wilhelm von Steuben was among the first to practice "don't ask, don't tell." During the Revolutionary War, Benjamin Franklin was in France, and one of his jobs was to find European soldiers who would fight for the Americans. As was his habit, Franklin often used local issues and the wrongdoings of officers to get them to work for the United States as a way to escape in an honorable way. Wilhelm von Steuben was one of these officers. He had been in the Prussian army before meeting Franklin, but at that time he was being held in jail on charges of having physical relations with several young officers below him in rank. Franklin wrote a letter to George Washington introducing the Prussian and lied about von Steuben's war experience. He didn't mention the charges that were coming up and sent von Steuben on his way to America. While in America, von Steuben brought a group of young helpers with him. One of them was Pierre Etienne de Ponceau, who was his lover and helper. It's not clear if Franklin told Washington ahead of time about the Baron's sexuality, but Washington found out quickly and chose to ignore it while the Baron helped put together a new army from the American units. When the revolution was over, von Steuben decided to stay in America. He lived with a series of young men, including Ponceau, whom he called his sons. He never got married or had kids. Ben Walker and William North, his heirs, were both young officers who worked for him all the way back to the winter at Valley Forge. After he died in 1794, he left them his New York home. John Randolph of Roanoke was asexual. In the early days of the United States, John Randolph was a powerful politician who served in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. For a while, he was also the U.S. minister to Russia. Randolph owned slaves and wanted to see a colony in Africa set up for freed slaves and former slaves. He was also strongly against the federal government growing, and he was also against the Missouri Compromise, which made Missouri a slave state. He wore flashy clothes, strutted around Washington and the House floor with his dogs following him, and fought Henry Clay in a fight. He also fought with his hands twice with Willis Alston, another congressman. The first time was in the Capitol building, where other lawmakers kept the two men apart. Randolph had the voice of a child his whole life, never got facial hair, and wasn't interested in either sex, but people of his time said he had a crush on Andrew Jackson. He did show some interest in drugs and booze. Randolph had tuberculosis that he didn't know he had for most of his life. The pain of his illness was probably the first reason he used opium. He never went through puberty because of the disease, which is why he sounds and looks young and isn't interested in sexual things. When someone said that his impotence showed he wasn't a man, he replied, "Why should a man take pride in a quality in which a jackass is his infinite superior?" At the age of 60, Randolph finally gave up and died from tuberculosis, opium, and booze. We hope you liked this video. Subscribe to the channel if you're a history addict, and please let us know about civilization or time period we should talk about. Also watch another video here.